What happens when one of Hollywood's most laid-back actors walks into the most heated political talk show on television and completely flips the script? Well, that's exactly what went down when Matthew McConaughey appeared on The View, and what started as a simple book promotion turned into one of the most intense television moments of the year. If you want to see how this unfolds, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below about what you think really happened here. So there's Matthew McConaughey, sitting across from the panel of The View, promoting his latest memoir. The atmosphere starts friendly enough. You know how these things usually go. Joy Behar's doing her typical host routine, asking about his book, his family, the usual celebrity interview stuff. McConaughey's in his element, that signature Texas drawl, working its magic. Talking about life lessons and personal growth, everything seems pretty standard for daytime television. But then Joy shifts gears. You can see it in her body language, the way she leans forward, that look in her eyes that regular viewers know means she's about to go political. She starts asking about his views on certain social issues, really pressing him on topics that weren't even related to his book. McConaughey, still keeping it cool, giving those philosophical answers he's known for, but you can sense something building. Joy keeps pushing. She brings up his past comments about finding middle ground in politics, about how he thinks people need to listen to each other more. But instead of exploring that thoughtfully, she starts getting confrontational. She's questioning whether his approach is naive, whether he's really just privileged enough to stay above the fray while other people suffer. The other hosts are jumping in too, creating this whole pile-on situation. Now here's where it gets interesting. Most celebrities in this position would either back down, apologize, or just try to change the subject back to their book. But McConaughey does something completely different. He sits back in his chair, takes this long pause, and you can practically see the gears turning in his head. When he finally speaks, his voice is still calm, but there's this steel underneath it that wasn't there before. He starts talking about assumptions, about how the panel is assuming they know his life, his struggles, his motivations. He mentions growing up in a working-class family in Texas, about times when his family couldn't afford basic necessities, about watching his father work multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. His voice never raises, but every word is hitting like a hammer. Joy tries to interrupt him, to redirect the conversation, but McConaughey just keeps going. He talks about the assumption that because he's successful now, because he's famous, that somehow invalidates his perspective on struggle and hardship. He mentions specific moments from his childhood, times when his family faced real adversity, and how those experiences shaped his worldview. The studio gets incredibly quiet. You can hear the tension building, and Joy's clearly realizing that this isn't going the way she expected. She tries to clarify her position, to soften what she said earlier, but McConaughey is not letting her off the hook. He addresses her directly, asking her why she felt the need to make assumptions about his background without actually asking about it first. Then he does something that completely catches everyone off guard. He starts asking Joy questions, not aggressive questions, but pointed ones, about her own assumptions, about her approach to dialogue, about whether she's really interested in understanding different perspectives or just in confirming her own beliefs. The dynamic has completely shifted. Suddenly Joy's the one being interviewed, and she's clearly uncomfortable with it. The other hosts try to jump in to help her out, but McConaughey addresses each of them in turn. He's not angry, he's not shouting, but he's absolutely relentless in his logic. He points out contradictions in their arguments, assumptions in their questions, and the irony of them talking about empathy and understanding, while simultaneously dismissing his perspective without even trying to understand where it comes from. Joy's getting more defensive by the minute. You can see her face getting red, her voice getting higher. She starts talking about how celebrities should use their platforms responsibly, about how his moderate positions might actually harm people who need advocates. But McConaughey turns this around on her too, asking her about the responsibility of journalists and talk show hosts, about whether creating division and conflict is really helping anyone. The conversation reaches this crescendo where Joy finally loses her composure a bit. She raises her voice, starts talking over him, trying to regain control of the interview. But McConaughey just sits there, lets her finish, and then responds with this devastating calm that makes her outburst look even more unprofessional by comparison. He thanks her for proving his point about the importance of listening and respectful dialogue. Chat controls Sonnet for that moment of silence after McConaughey's comment about respectful dialogue hangs in the air like smoke. You can see Joy processing what just happened, realizing she walked right into his trap. But instead of backing down, she doubles down. She starts talking about how easy it is for him to preach about civility when he doesn't have to worry about the real-world consequences of political decisions. Her voice is sharp now, cutting, and she's leaning forward like she's going in for the kill, but McConaughey doesn't flinch. Instead, he asks her a simple question that stops her cold. He wants to know what she thinks the real-world consequences are of the approach she just demonstrated. Not political consequences, not policy consequences, but human consequences. What happens to dialogue, to relationships, to society, when every conversation becomes a battle where someone has to lose? Joy tries to deflect, talking about how some issues are too important for politeness, how sometimes you have to fight for what's right, but McConaughey presses her on this. He asks her to define what fighting means in this context. Is it talking over people? Making assumptions about their character? Refusing to listen to perspectives that don't align with yours? Because if that's fighting for what's right, he says, then maybe we need to reconsider what right actually means. The other panelists are trying to jump in, but McConaughey's on a roll now. He starts talking about the difference between being passionate and being effective. He mentions conversations he's had with people across the political spectrum, times when he's changed minds, not by attacking or dismissing, but by finding common ground and building from there. His examples are specific, personal, and they make Joy's approach look juvenile by comparison. Joy's getting frustrated because she can't pin him down. Every time she tries to put him in a box, he slips out of it with logic and experience. She accuses him of false equivalency, of both sidesism, of privileged centrism. But McConaughey doesn't defend against these labels. Instead, he asks her why she needs labels at all. Why can't she just engage with his actual words and ideas? Instead of trying to categorize them, this question clearly hits a nerve. Joy starts talking about how labels matter, how positions matter, how you can't just float above politics when people's lives are at stake. But McConaughey turns this around beautifully. He agrees that people's lives are at stake. That's exactly why, he says, we can't afford to keep approaching every conversation like a war, where the goal is to destroy the other side rather than find solutions. He gives a specific example. He talks about a town hall meeting he attended in Texas, where people from completely different political backgrounds came together to solve a local water crisis. He describes how the initial meeting was full of the same kind of combative energy Joy's been displaying, with people talking over each other, making assumptions, refusing to listen. Nothing got accomplished. But when they changed the approach, when they started with shared values and built from there, they actually solved the problem. Joy interrupts him, saying that local issues are different from national politics, that the stakes are higher, the divisions deeper. But McConaughey challenges this too. He asks her if she really believes that the stakes being higher means we should be less thoughtful, less respectful, less willing to understand each other, because if that's true, he says, then we're basically admitting that when things matter most, we're going to abandon everything that makes us decent human beings. The studio audience is completely silent now. You can feel the weight of what he's saying settling over everyone. Joy tries to recover by pivoting to specific policy issues, trying to get him to take concrete positions that she can attack. But McConaughey won't play that game. Every time she brings up a policy, he brings it back to process, to how we talk about these things, to whether we're more interested in being right or being effective. He tells a story about his father, about a time when his dad had to mediate a dispute between neighbors over a property line. Both sides were convinced they were right, both had lawyers, both were ready to spend thousands of dollars and years of their lives fighting in court. But his father sat them down and asked them what they really wanted. Not what they thought they deserved, not what they thought the law said, but what they actually wanted their lives to look like. Turns out, what they both wanted was to live peacefully next to each other, to not have to worry about conflict every time they walked outside. Once they admitted that, the solution became obvious. They hired a surveyor, split the cost, accepted the results, and moved on with their lives. The whole thing took an afternoon instead of years, cost hundreds instead of thousands, and both families ended up happier. Joy tries to dismiss this as naive, saying that political issues are more complex than property disputes. But McConaughey asks her how she knows that. Has she ever tried approaching political conversations the way his father approached that neighbor dispute? Has she ever started by asking people what they really want, what kind of society they want to live in, instead of immediately attacking their positions? The question hangs there, and Joy realizes she doesn't have a good answer. She starts getting defensive again, talking about how her job is to hold people accountable, to challenge harmful ideas, to give voice to the voiceless. But McConaughey doesn't let her hide behind the job description. He asks her if what she just did to him, making assumptions about his background and motivations without asking, if that's really holding him accountable or if it's just performing outrage for entertainment. That question about performing outrage hits Joy like a physical blow. You can see it in her face, the way her expression changes from defensive anger to something closer to shock. For the first time in this entire exchange, she's actually speechless. The other panelists are looking at each other, clearly unsure whether they should jump in or let this play out. The silence stretches for what feels like forever. When Joy finally responds, her voice is different, quieter, less certain. She says she's not performing anything, that she genuinely cares about the issues they discuss. But McConaughey nods and says he believes her. That's exactly the problem. he says, she cares so much that she's forgotten how to communicate with people who might care just as much but express it differently. He leans forward slightly, his voice taking on this almost gentle quality that somehow makes his words even more powerful. He tells her that passion without wisdom is just noise, that caring without listening is just self-indulgence, that being right without being effective is just ego. The studio is so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Joy tries to rally, bringing up specific examples of injustice, of times when strong voices and confrontational approaches have led to positive change. But McConaughey doesn't dismiss these examples. Instead, he acknowledges them and then asks a crucial question. In those historical moments of confrontation that led to change, were people confronting ideas and systems, or were they confronting individuals trying to have conversations? The distinction is subtle but devastating. He's not arguing against confrontation as a tool for justice. He's arguing against using confrontational tactics in dialogue, against treating every conversation like a battle. Joy realizes she's been conflating the two, and you can see her struggling to find solid ground to stand on. McConaughey continues, talking about the difference between confronting power and confronting people. When civil rights leaders sat at lunch counters, he says, they were confronting a system of oppression, not trying to have a productive dialogue with creationists. But when they did engage in dialogue, when they sat down to negotiate and find solutions, they approached those conversations with dignity, respect, and a genuine desire to find common ground. He asks Joy what system of oppression she thinks she's confronting by making assumptions about his background and motivations. What injustice is she fighting by refusing to listen to his perspective? Who is she helping by turning what could have been a thoughtful conversation into a verbal sparring match? Joy's answers are getting weaker, more scattered. She talks about platforms and responsibility and the need to challenge privilege. But McConaughey keeps bringing it back to the actual conversation they're having. He asks her to show him exactly where in their exchange she challenged any actual ideas rather than attacking strawman versions of positions he never took. Then he does something that completely floors everyone. He starts breaking down the conversation they just had, piece by piece, showing her exactly where she could have approached things differently. When she questioned his understanding of struggle, he says, she could have asked about his background instead of assuming. When she disagreed with his positions, she could have engaged with his actual words instead of creating easier targets to attack. He's not doing this to humiliate her. His tone is almost professorial, like he's genuinely trying to help her understand. But the effect is absolutely devastating because it shows everyone watching exactly how intellectual dishonest Joy's approach has been. She's been fighting shadows while claiming to fight for truth. Joy makes one last attempt to regain control, talking about how his approach sounds nice in theory but doesn't work in practice. But some people and some ideas don't deserve respectful engagement. But McConaughey asks her, who gets to make that determination? Who decides which people are worthy of respect and which aren't? Because once you give someone that power, he says, you've basically abandoned any pretense of principled dialogue. He tells one final story about a conversation he had with someone whose political views he found genuinely offensive. Instead of attacking or dismissing, he listened. And what he found underneath the offensive positions were fears and experiences. Matt he could understand, even if he disagreed with the conclusions. By acknowledging those fears and experiences, by treating the person as human rather than as an enemy, he was able to plant seeds of doubt about some of the more extreme positions. The person didn't completely change their mind overnight, McConaughey explains, but they did become more open to different perspectives. And that openness, multiplied across thousands of similar conversations, is how real change happens. Not through confrontation and humiliation, but through patient, respectful engagement with people's actual humanity. Joy is clearly out of ammunition. She makes some weak comments about time constraints and the need to move on to other segments. But everyone can see that she's been completely outclassed. McConaughey thanks her for the conversation, says he hopes it was as educational for her as it was for him. And that simple statement contains more devastating power than any insult could have. As the segment ends, you can see the other panelists. Looking shell-shocked, Joy is trying to recover her composure, but there's no hiding what just happened. McConaughey didn't just win an argument, he demonstrated a completely different way of engaging with disagreement. And in doing so, he exposed the bankruptcy of the approach that defines so much of our public discourse. The man came on to promote a book and ended up giving a in how to dismantle bad faith arguments while maintaining your dignity and principles. That's what happens when someone who actually understands dialogue meets someone who just thinks they do. What did you think of McConaughey's approach? Could you have stayed that calm under pressure? Drop a comment below and make sure to subscribe for more breakdowns of the moments when celebrities completely flip the script on their interviewers.